morning. It's good to be back with you guys. We are starting a series for the next several weeks called The Next Step, and you may notice I'm not Jeff. Jeff has decided to take his next step onto Space Mountain. So he and Laura, the kids, are in Disney World this morning, and they sent you their warmest greetings from warm Orlando. So I'm always glad to be here whenever we get a chance. We really enjoy worshiping with you guys. I haven't been able to sing since Thanksgiving. I got some kind of weird sinus thing that hit me like the day before Thanksgiving. I was struggling to teach class, anything. And this is the first morning in literally 6 weeks that I've been able to sing. So I'm glad it came back with you guys this morning. The series we're getting ready to start, it's called The Next Step. And over the course of the next 6 weeks, while we're on our way to the season of Lent, which leads into Easter, the notion is we want to talk about what it is that you, in your own personal journey, need to do to go further in your walk with Christ. What's next for you? Okay, now, over the course of the next few weeks, you're going to talk about a lot of different things. What it means for you to be a disciple, to pick up a cross and to follow. What sort of demands that places on your life in terms of your discipleship, in terms of your calling to missions in the world. What sort of things are going to be next for you? What more does God have in store for you? That series begins in where you might think it would begin, salvation. Before we can talk about what's next, we need to talk about what's first. And that's where we begin this morning, with the story of salvation. You may notice that I came up here unarmed this morning. No notes, no books, nothing. It's because this morning I want to talk from my heart to your heart, and let's tell a story. Let's tell the story of our faith. That's our necessary starting point. And before we run ahead to what's really the theme verse of the morning, John 3:16, before we run ahead to the story of how God so loved the world that he would send his only Son, that whosoever would believe in him would not perish, but will have everlasting life. Before we come to that, we need to back up. We need to talk about, if we're talking about being saved, what are we saved from? Why do we need saving? What's so wrong with us? And for that, we've really got to go to Genesis 3. Now, most of you know, I teach New Testament. That's not Genesis. And the Old Testament folks, they're the ones that have to deal with creation stories and Genesis and all the mess that comes with trying to introduce college students to Genesis. I don't have to deal with those questions. But for a New Testament professor, I spend an inordinate amount of time in Genesis because this story is so foundational for this question of salvation. You cannot understand Jesus unless you understand what happens with Adam and Eve, unless you understand what happens in the Garden of Eden, unless you understand how that story is not just one story, but it's your story and it's my story. So we begin there this morning. The story of Adam and Eve, the first humans. And you know the story. Placed in a garden, paradise, they've got everything they want. They're just given one rule: don't eat off of that tree. And you know how the story goes. They eat off that tree. There are a lot of really wrong ways to read that story. One of the really wrong ways of reading that story is to read that story as if it's some sort of story about God's power. It's not a story of God's power. This is a story of God's love. And those are very different things. To read that story as a story of God's power is to misread it. It's not a story about a God who is sovereign and in control and powerfully exercising his dominion over every detail of the universe. And there are a lot of people in our world that tell the story that way. It's not what the story is. This is not a story about a God who decrees everything before the creation and then watches it unfold. If that's what this story is, Genesis 3 is a real problem. This is not a story about a God who intended for everything to go wrong. What kind of God would do that? This is not a story about a God who decided to create stuff that would be broken by his will, by his design, and by his intention. That's not his dream. The world you live in is not what God had in mind. And you've heard this morning over and over in every song. Genesis is really a story of love. And love is about relationship. And this is who God has been from eternity. Before there was a creation, when all there is in the universe is just God. We talk about God as Trinity, don't we? Father, Son, Spirit. 3 persons, one God. And we can figure out the mind-boggling math of all that some other time. But listen to the terms we use. Father, Son. Those are relational terms. That our one God has 3 different persons self-contained somehow that interrelate. Relate. That's the key. Because the very nature of God is relationship. It's core to the being of God. Before there is a world, before there is human, when it's just God, God's already in relationship. And that's the defining quality of this God. Not power, not glory, not sovereignty, not anything else like that. The defining quality of this God is relationship, love. And that's the story of the creation too. God, because God is a God of relationship and a God of love, creates a world that God can love. And that, if the story goes correctly, can love God in return. Of course, that's where Genesis 3 goes sideways. The humans were supposed to love God. And love can never be forced. Love must always be chosen. The sad reality of Genesis 3, and the reason that we all need saving, is that the God who gives us a choice to love Him must also give us a choice to reject Him. And that's the story of Genesis 3. Adam, Eve, they chose to go their own way, to be their own boss, to call their own shots, to selfishly design their own life, and that's sin. That's where sin enters our world, in that moment. And Genesis 3, though it is the story of the first couple, it's not just their story, it's your story and it's my story. Because all of us follow the same path. We could choose God, but we all choose self instead. We all choose to go our own way. We choose to reject the offer of love and relationship that God has put before us. I think I've mentioned this text to you before, but one of the most significant and impacting texts for me is found in Genesis 3 when God gives the humans the command about that tree. Remember what He says to them? Don't eat fruit from that tree. And the consequence, do you remember? On the day you eat of that tree, what will happen? You will surely die. Now that's pretty clear, isn't it? Don't eat that tree, and on the day you do it, you will die. That text has become so meaningful to me because the humans do exactly what God tells them not to do. They eat that tree. And do they die? They sure don't. And I know we go out of our way, right, to talk about, spiritually they die, right? But let's be literal about the text. Let's read what it says. It says, the day you eat that fruit, you will die. They don't die. Now you got to answer some questions about God here. Is God just going to let the humans mock Him? Was God not really serious about that? No, I think what's very important about that text is this tells us something that is essential about the nature of God. Remember, if this were a story about a God who is defined by sovereignty, by power, who carried out that promise? They would have died. This is not a God defined by those things. This is a God defined by love. This is a God who chooses, instead of following through with what God promised would happen, you will die. Instead, God offers life and redemption anyway. God chooses mercy. God chooses love. God chooses relationship. And something in to be sure. They get kicked out of paradise. Life's going to be ugly from here out. And that's all very clear. But it doesn't come with a death penalty. God chooses mercy. And the rest of the biblical story is the story of God trying to redeem what we ruined. That's the whole Bible. God made it good. We broke it. God's trying to fix it. That's the whole story. It's also the story of salvation. It's a story of love. That theme verse of our faith, John 3:16. That as you go home today and you watch the NFL playoffs, you'll notice somebody is holding that up right behind the field goal post. All right? Every game. John 3:16. Hear it again. For God so loved. This is a story that is eminently about the love of God. That God is choosing love rather than wrath. That God is choosing relationship rather than punishment. That this is not a God who will be defined by his anger, by his power, but this is a God who will be defined by his